So I'm now inside what would have been part of the Roman Saxon Shore fort. Reculver, or Reculbrium, as it would have been known in Roman times, was, like Brancaster, one of the first fort, well, the first fort that we saw on day 2. Was one of the first forts of the Saxon Shore to be built. Initial construction being around about 230 AD. And the original construction was not only similar in date, but also similar in size to Brancaster, being around about 3 hectares and being very much square rather than rectangular, with a kind of rounded corners to each of the 4 compass corners of the original fort. This is what looks to me like one of the corners. This, I think, would have been the northeastern corner, where the only bit of intact wall, although it looks as though it's been restored, exists here. There most probably would have been gatehouses in the walls, certainly in this wall here. Difficult to say exactly where it would have been, but possibly out this way somewhere. So, gatehouses approaching the fort. Like Brancaster again, the fort seems to have been constructed on the site of a pre-existing either smaller fort or certainly a signal station. You can imagine that this would have been a classic place for the Romans to have located a signal station in the early years after the invasion. The sighting at the fort here is clearly very significant. We've noted before how the coastline has changed, and it's obviously changed here. We can see the erosion that has taken place, cutting in half the fort. But it's important to actually look away from the fort. Up in that direction is Margate and the Isle of Thanet, which we won't be visiting today. But the reason it's called the Isle of Thanet is because in Roman times that was an island, and what we had in the low-lying part between where we are over towards the island, that was all water. That was the Whitstable Channel, and it separated mainland Kent, where we are, from the Isle of Thanet. The point is that in order to get to the Thames, sailing from the continent, the chances are you would sail not round Thanet, but up the Whitstable Channel, cutting across here into the Thames that way. So this was a corner point, if you like, looking at the coastal traffic coming up the Whitstable Channel into the mouth of the Thames here. Archaeological evidence suggests that the fort was strengthened towards the end of the 3rd century AD, and that's significant, and we'll talk about that later on today perhaps. I mentioned right at the beginning that the obvious reason why these forts are constructed was to repel potential Saxon invaders, but that's not the full story. There's another important point relating to the refortification at the end of the 3rd century that we'll talk about later on. It was potentially also refortified in the first half of the 4th century, but then was abandoned altogether around about 360 AD. Following the departure of the Romans, again like several of these forts, the site was occupied by the Anglo-Saxons, and like Bradwell, Borough and possibly also Wharton, became a centre of Christianity, and King Egbert of Kent founded a monastery here in 669 AD. And the Church of St. Mary's that we can see here now, as I said, it's not Roman at all, but the Church of St. Mary's, the ruined church, has its roots in that early 7th century Christian foundation here. This is Sandwich in Kent, a lovely little place that I've just discovered. There's a river down here, and it's an obvious place to stop and have something to eat. Not that the thing that we eat in millions every day is named after the town. It was coined after the eating habits of John Montague, the 4th Earl of Sandwich. Looking at this river today, it's perhaps hard to believe that this was once a port, and it was a port that was no stranger to odd events in English history. It's believed that this is where the first captive elephant was landed in England by the Emperor Claudius. Certainly the first very clearly recorded elephant was landed here in 1255, which was delivered at the quayside here, was a gift from the French king to Henry III, and it was taken on foot from here in Sandwich all the way through Kent to the Royal Menagerie at the Tower of London. The journey through Kent proceeded without incident, except when a bull in a field in a roadside took umbrage and tried to attack the elephant, and it's said that in one move the bull was thrown by the elephant and killed outright. Matthew Paris, who drew the elephant, also observed that this was the only elephant ever seen in England, or even in the countries on this side of the Alps, wherefore the people flocked together to see the novel sight. And talking of novel sights, I'm really not quite sure why a car is just stuck here next to the river on this bridge here. Most strange. Oh well, despite that, I rather like Sandwich. Given that we are now at Richborough, of which more later, you can see a stretch of the castle wall behind me. Here I thought it would be appropriate to say a little bit more about the theories around why these forts were actually built in the first place. They're clearly of military design, one can see that, and consequently the most widely accepted explanation is that these forts formed a string of coastal defences aimed at repelling would-be Saxon raiders and settlers. And as I pointed out before, it's important in this regard to note that the forts are also part of a wider network of forts that also exist on the coasts of northern France and Belgium. Now, whilst this defensive theory makes a lot of sense, it doesn't perhaps explain the whole theory. First of all, given that some of the forts were initially constructed prior to the main Saxon and Frankish incursions, Brancaster, the first fort that we visited, is a good example of that. It's more likely that some of the forts at least might have started their life as fortified trading ports, protecting and guarding the safe passage of important and valuable cargoes coming and going from this western province of the Roman Empire. Another important theory, however, is that the forts were built, or at least refortified, to repel a Roman invasion. Now, in case you're wondering whether I said that sentence the right way round, let me explain. It's fairly well known that initially Julius Caesar led two failed attempts to invade Britain in 55 and 54 AD. After that, Claudius finally was successful in capturing control in Britain between around about 43 and roughly 51 AD. But what is less well known is that some 250 years later, the Roman Empire invaded Britain yet again. Let me try and explain. Around 286 AD, a distinguished Roman sailor called Carausius, who came from what is roughly the coastal parts of Belgium, northern France these days, he was given command of the Classus Britannicus, essentially the Roman fleet which controlled the eastern English Channel. Now, he was specifically given instructions to eliminate the Frankish and Saxon pirate ships attacking commercial Roman shipping. However, the story goes that rather than intercepting the marauding pirates before they attacked the Roman vessels, Carausius attacked the Roman pirates after they had raided the Roman trading ships, and in doing so took the plunder for himself, selling it off at a handsome profit. Now, when word of this reached Rome, you can imagine that the powers that be were not best pleased, and his execution was ordered. Now, not to be outdone, in response, Carausius essentially broke off from the empire altogether and declared himself to be emperor of the lands under his control in Britain and northern Gaul, i.e. northern modern-day France. Thus, in 289 AD, Britain broke away from the Roman Empire per se, and thus the forts may have been built to protect Carausius's breakaway empire from being re-invaded by the Romans. As it happens, the breakaway empire was short-lived. Carausius was killed in 293 AD by his previous co-conspirator and partner in crime, Alectus, who himself was killed 3 years later when Britain was recaptured by the Romans under Constantius. So, Whilst some of the forts of the Saxon Shore were undoubtedly used, if not strengthened and refortified during the Carausian revolt, in fact coins minted by Carausius have been found at several forts, in reality there is no simple answer as to why these forts were built. And rather than pointing to or giving a single explanation, given that these forts were not built at a single point in time, it's perhaps better to think of them as evolving and developing due to all of the reasons that we've talked about: protecting trade, stopping Saxon incursions, fighting Romans off from re-invasion. Think of them as evolving over time for all of the purposes that we've just mentioned. So we have reached Richborough, or Rutapia as it would have been known to the Romans. Richborough was a place of great significance to the Romans. It's generally thought to have been the landing place for the invasion under Claudius in 43 AD. Evidence for this comes from archaeological work that suggests in the area roughly where I'm standing now there were some mid-1st century ditches and earthen fortifications that were erected here, probably as a bridgehead guarding the invasion force before they set out on their conquest. But not only that, there's much clearer evidence that we're going to go and have a look at in a minute. This predates the construction of the fort, and they're the foundations of a magnificent arch that was built here, which was at the beginning point facing Watling Street, running up towards London. Watling Street would have been in that direction, and the arch marked the end or starting point of Watling Street, depending on which way one looked, and would have gone out through a gateway there. This wasn't any small arch. Think Marble Arch in London, think the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. Built from granite and clad in marble, imported all the way from Italy. Nothing had probably been seen like it before in Britain. Well, probably nothing other than Stonehenge. And it was a statement of Roman power and intent. The arch, the port would over in this direction, and the settlement that grew up here all predate the building of the fort that we see today. They all predate these walls that we can see on the three sides. They've eroded on that side. Indeed, with a certain irony, there's again evidence that points to the fact that the huge arch that was here was actually torn down by the Romans themselves in order to provide building materials for the fort when it was erected around about 275 AD. This is where the eastern wall would have been, and That, together with sections of the northern and the southern wall, have been completely lost to coastal erosion. But we can tell from what remains it was clearly rectangular in shape, with the northern and southern walls being slightly longer than the eastern and western ones. Like the other forts built around the same time, it also had projecting towers on each of its corners, as well as set along the walls. Indeed, you can see that there must have been one here in this section of the wall. One curious feature about this fort is that we know that the southern wall, the one over there, we can see that that was built all in one single section, but the northern wall, which is the most complete, this one here, you can tell that it was actually constructed in separate sections, whereas that wall was completed all in one go. This one wasn't. So maybe the Romans just couldn't get the labour that they needed. We all know how difficult it is to get builders these days. This is the northern wall, and you can see, here we go, clear evidence of a tower projecting out from the wall, and beyond it, defensive ditches. Following the period of Roman occupation, like several of the forts that we've visited so far, Richborough also had an Anglo-Saxon church dating back to the 10th century here. However, there's some evidence to suggest that there might have actually been a much earlier church on the site, since what is believed to have been a stone hexagonal baptismal font dating to the end of the 4th century or the beginning of the 5th century has also been found here. Indeed, here are the remains of that potential font. So, an absolute gem of a fort, one that's had multiple uses over the centuries, and possibly unlike any of the other forts that we've seen, clearly more so than any of the forts we've seen, there was an important civilian town here in existence long before the fort was built. And what we see today is some 2 centuries later than the earlier Roman buildings that would have been here, but for which there's clear archaeological evidence of their existence. I've stopped at this rather impressive looking beach here at Deal in Kent. A man of Kent himself refers to it in his novel Bleak House, describing the beach to be as dull an appearance as any place I ever saw. If this was not enough, the traveller and observer William Cobbett described it in his Rural Rides of 1823 thus: Deal is a most villainous place. It is filled full of filthy looking people. I was glad to hurry along through it and to leave its inns and public houses. And if you visited the Royal Hotel, but I'm not sure that many of the filthy looking people are there here today. Well, it certainly looks quite appealing to me, but then I'm a softie when it comes to sea and beaches and piers. Despite the rather uncharitable descriptions of Deal by Dickens et al., Deal does have this rather splendid Tudor castle built by Henry VIII between 1539 and 1540 to fend off invaders yet again, this time not Saxons, but invaders from France. It was one of a string of 3 castles that Henry erected along this part of the coast. The two others being at Sandown and Warmer, not far from here. In construction, absolutely nothing like any of the Roman forts we've seen. Hopefully you can see here that you've got this deep moat and curvy walls so that you can point your cannons out in almost any direction. Unfortunately we can't see it here. One of the things I like about these Tudor forts is that if we were to go up into the air and look at it from above, they certainly remind me a little bit of a kind of Tudor rose, which is appropriate really, isn't it? I'm at St. Margaret's at Cliffe, and this is St. Margaret's Bay, which overlooks the English Channel. In the distance there you might be able to just see France. Well, I've just discovered, and I had absolutely no idea, that apparently Henry Royce of Rolls-Royce fame designed the first Rolls-Royce aero engine in a house near here in 1914. Well, there we go. What I do know is that, according to the International Hydrographic Organization, Leathercote Point marks the western end at the line which defines the divide between the North Sea and the English Channel. And Leathercote Point is just around here, which means, if I've understood this correctly, that bit of sea over there is the North Sea, and that bit of sea over there, that way, is the English Channel. So now we know. I'm just about to enter the English Channel, at least the area of it. When one thinks of Dover Castle, one normally thinks of white cliffs, and we think of this modern day Dover Castle. However, the Dover Castle that we're interested in, the Roman fort that was here, was essentially down there in the Roman port area of Dover. Current day Dover Castle is up on the eastern escarpment overlooking the town, and in Roman times there was a watchtower or lighthouse both on this escarpment, and we're actually going to go and see if we can find it later on, and on the escarpment opposite, essentially both marking to a certain extent the port or harbour mouth. There's the current day harbour, as well as acting as watch. In his first failed attempt to conquer Britain, Julius Caesar noted that the cliffs were so close to the shore that javelins could be thrown down from them, and therefore he very wisely chose not to land here. After the Romans had invaded here, Dover quickly became an important naval base and was home to the Classis Britannica, the Roman fleet, which protected merchant shipping, trading between this new province and the continent, as well as, of course, providing supplies and provisions for the land-based armies. This is the church of St. Mary in Castro, which, as the name implies, is the church built within the castle walls here. But next to it, which was sometimes used as a bell tower, is one of the Roman watchtower come lighthouses that stood overlooking the Roman port below. This is the one that survives on the eastern escarpment within the castle walls now, and it's believed to be one of the oldest structures in the country. Well, we're now down in the central area of Dover, or modern day Dover. The castle is the present day castle that I've just cycled down from, is up there, and here is the Roman Quay pub, and they clearly think they're onto something, and indeed this area of town, which is not far from the marketplace in Dover, which we'll go to in a minute, is indeed probably where the Roman quay was situated. the old market square in Dover. Unfortunately, I do think it's seen better days, but this is roughly where the Roman port would have been. We know relatively little about the Roman fort here in Dover, and that's because most of it and the Roman town that it was linked to has been built over by centuries of urban growth. It appears to have been built around about 275 AD. Indeed, pre-existing Roman buildings in the town and the port area were demolished to make way for the Saxon Shore fort. What little remains of it can be seen if I try and get a look over this wall here at the Dover Discovery Centre. Sorry about this, but I'm trying to hold my camera up and I can't see over the wall, but hopefully you can, because that is pretty much all you can see